You may or may not have noticed, my name is not Tyler Christensen. I am about 2 foot shorter than Tyler, and I have a beard. So if you're a guest and this is your first week, you wouldn't know the difference. But for those of you who do know the difference, Tyler is out this morning. I got a text from Eleanor, his wife, last night and said, hey, what do you think about preaching tomorrow? Tyler's not feeling well. He's been really sick all weekend. It's not COVID, but he is down and out. And so I had the really exciting privilege of writing a sermon this morning. So when I preached in the first service, I walked up and I had literally put the pen down 12 minutes before I started preaching. So, hey, it's a party, right? We roll with it. We are in our first Sunday of Lent, which is a really exciting time in the life of the church. If you're not familiar with Lent, if you didn't grow up in a tradition where you observed Lent, it's a 40-day period between Ash Wednesday and Easter, where we really, as Lynn said earlier, where we really reflect inward. We think about our lives. We usually give up something or take on a practice. And we do this all as we march towards the cross together, towards Good Friday and ultimately Easter. This is the first Sunday of Lent, and as a church, we've decided to do a sermon series as well as a small group study through the Sermon on the Mount. And so that's what we'll be doing this morning. We'll be touching a little bit on the Sermon on the Mount as a whole, but really focusing in on the first 12 verses, which are what we call the Beatitudes. I also want to tell you, if you've not joined, if you're not in a small group or your small group's not doing the Sermon on the Mount study, we'll be offering that each Sunday between the early service and the second service, and we'd love for you to come and join, even if you weren't here this week. And also there will be a virtual offering on Wednesday nights, and this is just such rich material. It's a shame that we have to cover all of this in just a few weeks of Lent. You could spend years just working through the Sermon on the Mount itself. The material that we're going to be covering this morning in verses 1 through 12, which is what we call the Beatitudes, we could literally spend an entire 6 months just unraveling the thread, the pieces of fabric that are so beautifully woven in the Beatitudes. And we'll do a little bit of that this morning, but just know that these 3 chapters are incredible. They are insanely prolific, both in their scope and their depth. You can spend so much time. In fact, yesterday, because I'm a complete nerd, I spent about 3.5 or 4 hours yesterday morning just reading commentaries on the Beatitudes. It wasn't in preparation for this because I didn't know I was going to have to do this morning, but it was just because there's just so much there. I was talking with someone yesterday and they said, you really spent 3.5 hours just on these 12 verses. You've been doing this for like 20 years. Like, don't you get it by now? And the truth of the matter is no, there's so much depth. There's so much there. There's so much amazing material. And I hope you'll find the same thing this morning. So the Sermon on the Mount, it's in Matthew chapters 5 through 7. There is an analog, there is a parallel to the Sermon on the Mount. It's found in the book of Luke. And that one's called the Sermon on the Plain. Big difference. One is said to be given on a mountain. The other is said to be given on a plain. Not a flying plane, but a plane, right? And so you have these 2 sermons that have very similar material, a lot of the same material, a few differences, and a different location. But the Sermon on the Mount, as found in Matthew, is definitely the more robust of the 2 sermons. Is definitely the larger and like I said, it has the broader scope and depth. If I'm being honest with you, the Sermon on the Mount is, those 3 chapters, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, are by far my favorite chapters in the entire Bible. Some scholars have said it's Jesus' greatest hits playlist, and it really is. I tell people all the time, I said, listen, if you want to jump into the Bible, if you really want to jump into the teachings of Jesus, don't go to Leviticus, all right? Don't start there. Start with the Sermon on the Mount, okay? Go do Leviticus eventually, because there's interesting stuff there too. But just these 3 chapters will give you a primer on everything else Jesus is about to do. The Sermon on the Mount is part pep talk, part warning label. You know when you see those commercials for the new drug that treats whatever ailment you didn't know you had until you saw the commercial? You know, when you see those commercials and they tell you a little bit about the drug, and all the people are happy and they're smiling and they're walking around doing life, and then it gives you all the list, all the warnings of the things that could happen. Well, that's part of what the Sermon on the Mount is too, right? Jesus is teaching us, he's giving us a pep talk, but he's also saying, look, if you follow me, there are going to be some negative repercussions to this too, and I want you to walk into this thing with eyes wide open. It's not just a pep talk, it's not just warnings, but it's also full of promises, where Jesus helps us understand that no matter what negative may come, the reward is so much greater. So as we dive into this series over the course of Lent, I want us first to think a little bit about this fun German theologian term called Sitzenleben, okay? Sitzenleben, which means place in life, okay? If you go to a seminary, you get to learn all these fun terms. A lot of them are German. And Sitzenleben helps us to locate whatever it is that we're reading in its cultural time and place, all right? Because what was written 2,000 years ago had its rooting, had its grounding in a certain understanding of the world, okay? It was written by a certain person, to a certain audience, to a certain group of people, in a certain time and place that had its own kind of political and socioeconomic, and all these different variances that go into that writing. So if we're gonna understand it, we have to do Sitzenleben, okay? And so when we're thinking about the Sitzenleben, the place in life of the Sermon on the Mount, we have to understand that, number one, this is a Jewish teaching. Jesus was a Jewish rabbi, okay? Throughout the Gospels, he's called rabboni, rabbi, teacher, okay? So this is a Jewish teacher teaching to a Jewish audience. Now, this is important to know that scholars kind of differ on who he was actually talking to in the moment of the Sermon on the Mount. Because if you read in chapter 4, what's happened is Jesus has called his first 4 disciples, okay? So the first 4 disciples have been called, and that could be his only audience. But at the beginning of chapter 5, it said a great crowd had gathered, and Jesus retreated up the mountain and began to teach his disciples. So we're not really sure. Was it just a little small group, or was he preaching, was it 4 or was it 400? We're not really sure. I'm not so much concerned with that as much as I'm concerned that he was not only teaching them, but he's teaching us right now. There's a universality to this teaching that transcends time and place and culture. But in order for us to better understand the words that he was saying, we have to go backwards. So the other thing that's really significant when we're looking at the place in life of this sermon is it says that Jesus retreated to a mountain. Okay, now if you go to Israel, which I hope you do, by the way, a little shameless plug, 1 o'clock today, Israel informational meeting online, Zoom, you can email me for the details. If you go to Israel with us, and we'll go to the Sea of Galilee, we'll actually go and get on a boat on the Sea of Galilee, but on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee is called the Mount of Beatitudes, and this is where they believe that Jesus delivered this Sermon on the Mount. It's a beautiful area. There's kind of a natural amphitheater just going up the hill there, so it makes all the sense in the world. But beyond the physical location of it being a mount, it's really important anytime we see an event happening on a mountain in the Bible. Think about it. Go back in the Old Testament. Look at the Hebrew Scriptures. Moses receives the 10 Commandments on a mountain. Moses overlooks the promised land from Mount Nebo. The story of Elijah and Elisha up on the mountains. Even, especially in Matthew, we'll see 5 more times where incredibly significant events happen on a mountaintop. So, just as you read the scripture, remember, anytime you see something happening and it says, and they went up on a mountain, your radar needs to perk up a little bit, okay? Your antennas need to go up because you need to realize that that is a way that the scripture writers would say, hey, I'm highlighting this for you, okay? They didn't have highlighters. I'm highlighting this for you. I want you to see this. Something big's about to happen, okay? Matthew especially uses this rhetorical device to help point out really significant things, and he's doing it here as well. So as we move into the text a little bit, we need to talk about the nature of the text. The Sermon on the Mount, especially let's talk about just the Beatitudes. The Beatitudes are very ambiguous in their language. Now, as soon as I say that, you're probably sitting a little uneasy because as Western modern thinkers, we don't like ambiguity, okay, especially with things that matter. I don't know if y'all saw this past week, the Mars rover landed. Amazing. Like, I get weepy when I watch that. I don't know why. Maybe I'm just a softie, but I just get so pumped when I watch that. And it landed. Let me tell you something. Those guys at NASA, those men and women at NASA, they don't want ambiguity, okay? They don't want a degree here, a degree there. They want specifics. And in our Western mind, we want specifics. We want it to be didactic. We want to know exactly what we're being taught because it's important. Well, Jewish teachers in the first century didn't see it that way. You see, ambiguity led to discussion. Ambiguity led to wrestling. Ambiguity led to a deeper understanding than just one individual could give. You see, when modern Western teachers will teach, we teach to the test, right? You know this fact and this fact and this fact, and here's how you should believe, right? We try not to do that at Grace. But in a Jewish mindset, you would open up these beautiful parables. See, Jesus taught in parables all the time. And if you notice, the disciples almost every time are kind of scratching their head. They're like, wait, now what did you mean by that? Right? There's only one time when Jesus actually interprets his parable. It's a really interesting thing. So, first century Jewish teacher teaching to a Jewish audience, there's some ambiguity in the text. I mean, think about some of these phrases that we encounter in the Sermon on the Mount, in the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Now take a step back from all the sermons you've heard. Take a step back from the small groups you participated in or even the commentaries you've read. And think about that term. Blessed are the poor in spirit. What does that even mean? Like, that's a really difficult thing to kind of parse. How do we understand that? Well, Jesus gave us that fairly ambiguous term to allow us to wrestle with it, to allow us to play with it, to allow us to interpret it in community and in conversation. So there are all of these pieces of the text that we have to rehear with new ears and see with new eyes. And that's what I'm going to encourage you to do this morning. But before we go any farther, let's actually read the text, okay? So if you have a Bible, you can turn open to Matthew chapter 5. This is verses 1 through 12, or you can read it along with us on the screen. So here it is. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to speak and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So this section is called the Beatitudes. That is not a biblical word, by the way. Okay, you're not going to find the word beatitude in the Bible. It was not called the Mount of Beatitudes before Jesus delivered this. Beatitude is actually a Latin term. It comes from the word beate, which is Latin for blessing, to be blessed. Okay, so and it comes from all these proclamations have "you are blessed." Blessed are they, right? And so it's a Latin word that kind of puts an umbrella over this section of Scripture. It's important to kind of lean into this idea of being blessed because I would argue that this term, blessed or blessing, is a culturally appropriated term in our kind of Western modern society. I'll never forget, I was in DC doing some consulting work for a church, and I was driving down the road, and this gigantic black Cadillac SUV that was completely blinged out, that had all the features you could pay for. I mean, it's probably $80,000, $90,000 Cadillac, pulls out in front of me and is going in front of me, and the license plate on the back said blessed. I'm pretty sure that's not what Jesus was talking about in the Beatitudes, right? And so this idea of blessed, or hashtag blessed, we see it on Instagram and on Facebook and such. This is a culturally appropriated term that we have to reject and push away from our kind of cultural, Western, modern American understandings of, in order to move back into a more biblical understanding. And the only way we can do that is to look back at the text and ask, where were times when people were called blessed? The most notable, probably the most recognizable, and maybe the most prominent is Abraham. You remember Father Abraham? Father Abraham had many sons. Many sons had Father Abraham. Abraham was called to be the father of a great nation. And in that calling story, it said, Abraham, you will be blessed. Here's what's significant, guys. It doesn't say, Abraham, you will be blessed, period. It says, you, Abraham, you are blessed, comma, to be a blessing. So when we think about blessing in terms of a biblical sense, we have to know that blessing comes with requirement, okay? We are blessed to be a blessing. We see this narrative, we see this arc all the way through Scripture. God calls us, God equips us, God blesses us, and then says, go and do likewise. Go and do the same. We are blessed to be a blessing. So when we come to the Sermon on the Mount, when we come to the Beatitudes, and Jesus saying, blessed are you, blessed are they, we have to know that there's not a period at the end of blessing. There's a comma, because it means that we are called to action because of that. It's also difficult because we've heard this so many. If you grew up in church, okay, let me put that caveat. If you grew up in church, you've probably heard these Beatitudes a ton of times. You've probably heard these verses from the Sermon on the Mount so many times. And when we hear something so often, we can become numb to it. It can lose its revolutionary kind of spirit. But if we will strip that away, if we will let ourselves hear this with new ears, all of a sudden, the revolutionary nature, the countercultural nature of what Jesus is saying here begins to percolate to the surface and gives us whole new understandings of the kind of people that God is calling us to be. So, like I said, we're not going to be able to cover each of the Beatitudes, but I do want us to spend just a moment and look at the operative words, okay, in each of these little sayings, in each of these blessing sayings. Let's just for a moment look at the operative words of each one. Blessed are the poor. Poor being the operative word. Mourn. Meek. Hunger. Merciful. Pure. Peacemaker. Persecuted. If we did a Family Feud style survey and went and asked 100 people, what is the commonality between all of these words, I guarantee you, unless we got some really churchy, goody two-shoes, they probably wouldn't say, oh, the commonality of all those is you're blessed. Yeah, you're blessed when you're poor. You're blessed when you're hungry. You're blessed when you're meek. You're blessed when you're persecuted. Nobody's going to say that. And if you and I are being honest, as good church people, we're not going to say it either because it doesn't make sense. It doesn't. It doesn't. You don't go to business school and they said, guys, here's what we want you to do. Be meek, right? Go ahead and go get persecuted. That doesn't happen, right? Our parents don't raise us to think that way. This is revolutionary. It's countercultural. When we look at those words, we have to move beyond the surface, okay? We have to get beneath the surface on these words And we have to understand that there is a greater story being told here. There's a greater context being told. Here's the thing. It's not that it just doesn't make sense to us. It didn't make sense to Jesus' audience either. Okay? If you are hearing Jesus talk in the first century, remember Jesus was speaking in the Galilee area. Jesus was speaking around Jerusalem and Samaria. If you hear Jesus talking, he says, "Blessed are the peacemakers." As a first century person in that time and place, the word peace is going to be translated into Latin in your head, and it's going to be translated into the word pax. And then that word pax is going to be coupled with another word, Romano, right? The Pax Romano, which means the peace of Rome. You don't think about peace being something gentle and meek and all that. You think about Caesar, and Caesar rules with an iron fist, and you get peace through the sword. Okay, that's the first century mind. It doesn't make sense to them either. Okay, so we're in good company in that regard. But I think in order for it to make sense to us, I think we're going to have to lean on another source. I think we're going to be really helped out if we lean into the American cinematic classic of 1984, The Karate Kid. Now, if you are under 35 years old, let me explain what The Karate Kid is to you. You probably have watched Cobra Kai. Karate Kid is the grainy flashback scenes that Cobra Kai points to, okay? Karate Kid, the first one was the best, second one was okay, third one's garbage, okay? Don't even watch the third one, don't worry about it, all right? If you want to fight me on this, we can do that after the service. What happens is you have this kid named Daniel LaRussa, okay? And Daniel moves with his single mom from New Jersey out to Southern California. All right? And Daniel moves into a new school. He gets beat up a lot. He's bullied. And he meets this man in his apartment complex named Mr. Miyagi. And Mr. Miyagi kind of takes him under his tutelage, under his wing, and he begins to teach him karate. Well, Daniel wants to learn how to fight and kick and punch and you know, all those good things that you do in karate. And Mr. Miyagi, every afternoon after school, has Daniel doing what? Do you remember? Wax on, wax off, right? Mr. Miyagi has this really cool old car, and he has Daniel waxing on, waxing off, waxing on, waxing off. And Daniel gets really frustrated during this. Okay, he's like, "Mr. Miyagi, I just want to learn karate. I get it that I'm having to kind of pay my price by waxing your car, but I just want to learn karate." Well, what you find out as the story goes is that this was not what it seemed, right? This became a defensive move, right? Somebody chops in, he blocks, and he blocks, and he blocks, wax on, wax off. And he begins to learn that there is a deeper method to what Mr. Miyagi has been doing the whole time. When we look at the Beatitudes, when we look at the Sermon on the Mount, we have to understand it in the same way as the Karate Kid with Daniel and Mr. Miyagi. There is something going on beneath the surface that we can't see until we get deep into it. So let's look at one of those. Blessed are those who mourn. Okay, so this is, if you're looking along in your Bible, this is verse 4 of chapter 5. It says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." So show of hands, how many of you have mourned before? Yeah, pretty much the whole room. If you've lived any life, you've mourned. And I guarantee you, out of all those people who raised their hand, while you were mourning, you didn't go, "Man, this is super. I really like this. Let's do it again next week," right? You don't go out on a date and be like, "Hey, what you want to do? You go grab some dinner and go mourn?" This is not what you do, right? Mourning is not a pleasant experience. But we have to flip the script and go a little deeper because our small group author, Amy Jill Levine, gives us a little take on this. She says, you know, it's impossible to mourn unless you've loved. You can't mourn something you haven't loved. You see, what mourning does is it's a recognition that we once had something. And that something weighed so heavy and so large in our life that when it was taken away, it left a gap. It left a hole that we just can't ignore. And so we mourn the loss of that thing. When I was 25, my grandfather died, Papa George. And he was one of those people that I mourned deeply. He was a giant in my life. He was kind, he was loving, he was a hard worker. He taught me so many things in the moment. I had no clue he was teaching me, but he taught me so many things. I remember walking up the steps at his and Granny Betty's house, and I'd walk up the steps, and I'd always find him in his study, and he'd be in there. He had a little wooden desk, and he'd be in there studying the Bible. He had all these commentaries, and he would study, and he would call me in, and he'd talk to me about the Bible. He was a hard worker, a good man, and someone who loomed large in my life. About 3 months before my oldest daughter, Mary Claire, was born, my pawpaw died. I preached his funeral. It was brutal. I wept openly through the funeral because there was a hole that was bigger than I knew what to do with. I mourned, and I still mourn for his loss. My wife lost both of her grandparents just in the past 6 months. And we were cooking dinner yesterday, and she said, just out of nowhere, she said, I miss Gigi and Pawpaw. She's mourning. You've mourned, and the reason why you've mourned is because you've loved. And when we look at this text, when we look at blessed are those who mourn, we can understand that we are blessed because we first loved. Remember the phrase, the little saying? It's greater to have loved and lost than to have never loved at all. You see, we can mourn because we experienced love. We experienced something bigger than ourselves. We had a connection that's no longer there, but thank God for that connection. And that mourning turns from sadness or anger or loss into fond memories. If we look back at the Bible, we can find times, especially in the Old Testament, where people mourned, where that word is used. And there's a couple times specifically. One is we see it in Isaiah, and we see it in the Psalms, where the psalmist would write and Isaiah would talk about how people, the Israelites, would weep by the shores of Babylon. They were in mourning for their home. You see, what happened was they had been overtaken by the Babylonian Empire. Then they had been taken captive to Babylon. And it said that they would sit on the shores of Babylon and remember home. And it said they would weep and they would be in mourning. There was a hole that they longed for to be filled. There's another time that we also see in the prophets where we see mourning, and it's the prophet who is mourning. Okay, it's Isaiah, it's Jeremiah. And what's happened is God would give the prophets a certain message, okay? And God would say to the prophet, go and proclaim this message to my people. And this message will bring them joy. This message will bring them goodness. It will bring justice to the world. It is what I want them to do. And so the prophet would go, and the prophet would proclaim the message, and then here's what would happen. Over and over and over again in the Bible, the people would reject the message. And it said the prophet would mourn. I don't know about you, but during COVID, I've dealt with a lot of depression. I've dealt with depression since I was 13 years old. And during COVID, I've dealt with a lot of depression, a lot of hard times. And on the surface, I knew why the depression was there. We're coming up on 500,000 deaths in America alone. We're mourning that as a country. We're mourning that as a people. And so that loss of life is definitely something to mourn. But as I tried to be reflective, as I tried to think about where that depression, where that anxiety and that mourning was coming from, I knew that wasn't the only answer, and I had to dig a little deeper. And as I dug a little deeper, here's what I found. I would feel this deep darkness inside of me, and frustration and sadness, as I'd see those videos on Facebook or I'd read news stories about people who just refused to wear a mask, who just were blatant and mean, and even would go and spit or cough in people's faces. And I felt this anger and this sadness all inside of me, and I realized that so much of my depression, so much of my sadness and mourning was because I was mourning for our culture, our humanity, that we're so divided, that we're so angry, and that we didn't even seem to care to do one tiny thing for our neighbor. There was a deep mourning, and I bet some of you have felt that too. Have a deep mourning for our healthcare workers and our frontline workers and our essential workers who go every single day. I've got several friends who are epidemiologists who are on the very front lines of this thing, And I mourn for them because they are working their tails off. And they see people who won't even do one small thing for someone else. I mourn. And that's what the prophet was talking about as well. So blessed are you when you mourn, because it means that you care deeply. It means that you've loved and have lost, but you've loved. So blessed are you when you mourn. Another one that's kind of interesting, this will be the last one we'll do this morning, but another one that's interesting is blessed are the peacemakers. Now, when we think about peacemakers, for me, Martin Luther King comes to mind. We just came off of Martin Luther King weekend in February, and MLK comes to mind, and we look back at him some 50, 60 years later and go, yes, he was a peacemaker, clap, let's put a quote on our Facebook page over MLK weekend from him, and we're all, blessed are the peacemakers. But let me tell you something. He was killed, right? I bet when his house was being firebombed, when his kids and his wife were in the house and it was being firebombed, I bet he wasn't feeling blessed at that moment. We can look back retrospectively and see the blessing, but in that moment, being a peacemaker didn't feel like a huge blessing. If we look deep into the Greek, there's actually 3 words in the New Testament for blessing. And the first one is galine. And this is the kind of peace, not blessing, I'm sorry, for peace. This is the kind of peace that you get when you're sitting on a dock on the lake and there's mist on the water, you hear the birds chirping, and it's that serenity peace. It's like, oh, this is good. And you kind of breathe a deep breath and can breathe a little easier. And it's that serenity peace that we often get in nature. So that's galine. The second kind of peace that we see in Greek is Harmonea. Okay, Harmonea, and you can imagine where we get where that correlates in our language, harmony, right? And generally that means in Greek that we're all of one mind. We're all kind of marching to the same beat. We all are in agreement, okay? And so that's another kind of peace where we're not arguing, we're singing Kumbaya, we got our arms around each other, it's all good. But neither one of those are the words that Jesus uses when he says, blessed are the peacemakers. He uses another word, and that word in Greek is irene. Irene. And here's what that word means. It means peace by making whole. Peace through justice. It's connected to the Old Testament word shalom, which again means wholeness, completion. And Jesus not only says, blessed are the peaceful, but blessed are the peacemakers. So we got this idea that in order to fulfill this beatitude, in order to do what Jesus calls us to do, we have got to be an active role in peacemaking in our world. We have to be about doing God's good work, bringing about justice. The prophets say, cutting down the mountains to fill in the valleys, right? Creating equality. Blessed are those who bring about wholeness and justice. You see, we're rewarded in our society not by being peacemakers, but by choosing a side. You're a Democrat or you're a Republican. You're left or you're right or you're wrong. You're Alabama or Auburn. We had 2 people this morning say, well, I'm Georgia and Georgia Tech. Okay, whatever your fight is, right? We reward people for taking a side. And not only for taking a side, but for demonizing the other side. Very rarely do we reward the people who step back and say, there's a third way here. And seeing people as God sees them. This group, they are beloved children of God. And this group, they are beloved children of God. And to see the pain and the harm and the sadness and the incompleteness and the brokenness of the oppressor. And to see the pain and the oppression and the hurt of the victim. And to step back and as a lot of theologians say, to find the third way. That's the only way we can find our ways of being peacemakers. And when we do that, we bring about blessing in our world. See, the Beatitudes teach us as people of faith that we live by a different understanding. We march to a different beat of the drum. We have a different set of norms. That the story is not always as it appears, that there's something bubbling underneath the surface that unless we're unless we're willing to dig a little deeper, we might never see. Jesus tells a parable of yeast. If you've ever made bread, you know that on the top it just looks like it's just kind of crusty when you're letting the bread leaven. But inside there, things are bubbling, things are working, there's magic going on and expanding, just like the kingdom of God is expanding in our midst. So we work from a different set of norms. We work from a different story. We are looking for the things that are bubbling underneath the surface that may not be the things that everyone else is pointing to. That maybe that happiness isn't something that we can buy or sell or subscribe to, but maybe true happiness, deep joy, is a thing that we find after we go through the valley of our deepest pain. We can mourn because we loved. See, these are the things that Jesus is pointing us to in the Beatitudes and is calling us to in the Sermon on the Mount. More than anything, I believe that Jesus is telling us this. There is a world that is alive and well and moving, and it's just underneath the surface. And it's there for you as long as you're willing to look for it.